Before I start, I'd like to just say how delighted I am to be here with all of you today. Your Reverend Kelly Clement is a dear and treasured colleague of mine. In fact, we are in a racial justice accountability triad group that meets monthly. It is so good to be with you today. So our reading today is from the Sufi mystic poet Rumi. It's titled, Don't Go Back to Sleep. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the door sill where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. The words from Rumi, Don't Go Back to Sleep, have been on my heart in this new year as we are reminded again of the insurrection at our nation's capital just 1 year ago. It was an awful reminder of white power, the act of intentionally wielding white privilege and whiteness to abuse power to maintain dominance. Tragically, we are going to keep facing the violence of white supremacy until it is gone, which is not likely to occur in our lifetime. But we have our Unitarian Universalist faith, our principles, and this community to call us onward and to encourage each other to remain awake and to keep doing the work. Now more than ever, we need to hold ourselves accountable and take responsibility and action. We must not sleep through the revolution. So Don't Sleep Through the Revolution was the title of Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1966 Ware Lecture, an address he gave at the Unitarian Universalist Association's General Assembly on May 18, 1966 in Florida. In his address, King suggests some of the things that the UU Church must continually do to remain awake through the Civil Rights Revolution. The Church, King argued, stands as a moral guardian of the community and of society. It has always been the role of the Church to broaden horizons, to challenge the status quo, and to question and break mores if necessary. I'd like to lift up some of Dr. King's words and ideas from that speech that can still inspire our commitment to the work of dismantling white supremacy and building the beloved community we so long for. And that is explicitly stated in the newly proposed 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism, which, as I understand it, this congregation affirmed and passed during a congregational vote last spring. The 8th principle, as a refresher, asks us for a commitment to undertake a dedicated spiritual journey to achieve justice for all oppressions, starting with racism. It states, we, the members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. This principle focuses on two key practices: building the multicultural, beloved community and taking action to dismantle racism in ourselves and in our institutions, which in my view will lead to spiritual wholeness. In fact, these practices are intertwined. So let's talk about the beloved community. It's an old idea. For the 12 most active years of his public ministry, from 1956 until his death in 1968, Martin Luther King used the phrase in speeches and sermons, articles, interviews, and most of his books. But he learned it from his study of nonviolence after reading Gandhi and Josiah Royce, philosopher and co-founder on the eve of World War I of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, which still thrives today and of which King was a member. For 100 years, they have been committed to the reconciliation of nations and peoples and to a kind of reconciliation within people, within us, the balance of conscience against the record of our daily life and practice, the balance of hope against paralyzing fear, the balance of action with reflection and prayer. As my colleague, the Reverend Victoria Safford, eloquently describes, the beloved community was not a goal or destination, and it was not any kind of idealistic Christian utopian dream, but instead a way of being, spiritually, politically, economically, emotionally, and intellectually. Beloved community is an attitude, an orientation of the heart. It's a disciplined understanding of your own relationship to other people, to everyone else on the planet, to every living thing. King explained it this way in his address to us. All life is interrelated, and somehow we are all tied together. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of all reality. Any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. This realization is absolutely necessary if we are to remain awake in this revolution. End quote. If you are religious, this realization that we exist in a network of mutuality tied together in a single garment of destiny is a religious discipline that goes by many names. Safford again explains, if you are seeking spiritual wholeness, spiritual balance, it is a spiritual discipline. If you are an ethical humanist, it is a deliberate moral stance. It is a daily practice, a spiritual politics that requires inclusivity, nonviolence, and the hard discipline of radical hospitality. It requires love, agape. Martin Luther King urged nonviolence and pointed out that most revolutions in the past have been based on hate for the perpetrators of an unjust system in an old order. King urged instead that we add the dimension of love to the center of our struggle. He spoke of agape, which is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men, an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. When one rises to love on this level, he loves a person who does the evil deed while hating the deed. And one day we will win our freedom, not only for ourselves. We will so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we will win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. So how do we go about practicing beloved community? I think it's helpful to realize that the idea of beloved community is not small. It is not an enclave. It can't be a gated community, nor one with a door or any barriers at all. Thus, a congregation cannot be beloved community because a congregation can never include everybody, every living, cherished thing, nor does it intend to. Instead, a congregation like this one can practice beloved community and live by and lean toward its intention. But the beloved community is something way larger. It is the widest circle of inclusive love you can imagine, embracing all persons, ancestors, descendants, and all of us. And thus it cannot be homogeneous in any way, and no single voice or party or position or denomination can own it. It intends a welcome so wide and deep that everyone within its sphere has equivalent standing, and their power derives from the shared risk of their diversity. For this reason, the beloved community is not devoid of conflict, but brave in the hard work of listening and forgiveness, the hard work of working it out with no souls overboard. For example, the civil rights activist Ruby Sales' life was changed when at the age of 17, she was standing on a sidewalk and a white man pointed a gun at her. She didn't see it, but another white man did, a young Episcopal divinity student. He leapt in front of her and was instantly killed by the bullet. Her life as a Black woman has been defined thus by her relationship in a single second to two white men. And she's still talking about the holy imperative of right relationship and love. She says that anger sometimes flares and righteous outrage and the community is strengthened thereby, if everyone stays at the table, learning and growing all together. The goal is reconciliation, not to destroy your opponent nor cast them out, but stay in the struggle till love wins, which means all of your life. This, of course, is no easy thing, as we all know from living in close quarters all the time with our families, our coworkers, our neighbors, our annoying Facebook friends, and in this political moment where dehumanizing others is so tempting, even feels urgent and necessary. In this moment, it can even feel virtuous. But we must reject that. When a reporter asked John Lewis once what beloved community would look like in real time, he said, it would be a country at peace with itself, peace among the citizens and peace within each conscience. Beloved community means that every day, every action, every interaction has to have that goal in mind. We can't heal the wounds of the nation by killing each other, even metaphorically. This is what makes it so beautiful, holy, and hard. Unitarian Universalist theologian Bernard Loomer has a way of describing this notion of practicing beloved community. He terms it growing our souls. Loomer says that the essence of the spiritual path is to receive rather than resist reality in the fullest possible sense. As we work to build networks of mutuality, those envisioned by Martin Luther King, we need to practice growing the size of our souls so we can take in the ever-increasing complexity and abundance of creation. Loomer wrote the word size, S-I-Z-E, in all capital letters whenever he described this concept, and he put dashes between each of the letters. He wanted to emphasize it as a growth imperative. He said by size, quote, I mean the volume of life that you can take into your being and still maintain your integrity and individuality. The intensity and variety of outlook that you can entertain in the unity of your being without feeling defensive or insecure. The strength of your spirit to encourage others to become freer in the development of their diversity and uniqueness. I mean the power to sustain even more complex and enriching tensions. End quote. Loomer argues that growing the size of your soul requires an increased consciousness of our fundamental interdependence and our relatedness. The term he used to describe this was the web of life. This is also what King was teaching. We can conceive of the world as a web of interconnected events and relationships. Loomer says we live in society, but our society also literally lives within us. We feed upon each other in all the dimensions of our lives, physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. The ability to harbor deep and uneasy contrasts is central to the spirituality of size, and it is critical for our racial justice work. Growing the size of our souls means bringing into consciousness and concern all of the interrelationships of the web in which we live, even those with whom we disagree or find morally repugnant. As we uncover the tragedies and devastation of systemic oppression and injustice, the work of racial justice can also be complicated and bring up deep feelings of sadness. For those of us who are white, feelings of shame and hopelessness can arise when we learn of our own complicity in the systems that perpetuate and uphold white supremacy culture. Growing our souls involves practicing receiving this complexity, accepting it, and allowing it to be connected to our own story, to impact, shift, and inform our own complexity. Developing a mindfulness practice can help us develop the spiritual muscles that ground us in awareness, insight, and resilience. For example, when we openly and honestly acknowledge and name that our UU tradition's history includes passionate advocates for the abolition of slavery, such as Theodore Parker, as well as ardent slaveholders such as John C. Calhoun. We increase the stature, size, and depth of our faith as Unitarian Universalists when we can hold these contrasts together. Another example is the vast range of positions held by UUs regarding the police abolition movement, from fully supporting the current model of policing to complete eradication of that model. The resolution of these extremes is not to find the median point, but to find ways of embracing the widest contrasts of the past without sacrificing the integrity of the present. To be clear, holding together and deeply feeling the intense contrasts of racial justice work does not mean that we are acquiescing or will not take action in the future. It simply means that as we take in and accept new knowledge, as well as whatever feelings of discomfort, sadness, and shame that accompany that new knowledge, we take time to slow down and practice self-compassion. The goal is to become more emotionally intelligent. That is, emotionally aware, articulate, and capable of acting in alignment with the insight that arises from increased racial literacy. Mindfulness practices help us resist seeking overly simplified answers to the most complex questions of our lives and encourage us to be humble and open to learning more to live with ambiguity, to stay present and engaged, even though the answers we seek and the outcomes we pursue are challenging and even elusive. If you would like a few resources for developing mindfulness practices for the purposes of dismantling racism within yourself, I'm placing 3 resources in the chat, 2 books and a website. You may have heard of some of these. The first book is My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. Another book is The Inner Work of Racial Justice by Rhonda McGee. And then there's also a website that has some compassion and self-awareness exercises that you can try. You might consider hosting an accountability group where you read and try some of these practices together with one another. Doing the hard spiritual work of growing our souls will help us see, in the words of Bernard Loomer and that are echoed in King, that we love because we are interdependent, because we enter into each other's lives. Love does not create our essential interrelatedness. Love is an acknowledgement of it. We love because we're bound to each other, because we live and are fulfilled in, with, and through each other. We love because a failure to love is a denial of the other, ourselves, and our relatedness. It results in a diminution of all of us, including God. My wager of faith is that growing the size of our collective souls will also help our congregations become a more diverse and inclusive community by helping us open spaces for relationship, for accountability, invention, and critique. Growing the size of our soul will help us work towards embracing a more complex sense of identity, one that incorporates both pride and accountability. I believe there is more to be gained in acting for justice than in maintaining individual or group dominance. There is a richer self, a more rewarding group identity to be gained through open-ended pluralism than through tightly defined exclusivity. As the Rumi poem says, you must ask for what you really want. What our faith asks of us, what our faith imagines for us, what our faith really wants for us is that somehow, right at this moment when our hearts break, we will find our way to see through that heartbreak. We will stay put, not close off, not run away, not hurt back, but keep on being in relationship, doing what we can to repair ourselves, each other, and the world. Let's be about this task together. Amen.